I think in the end, it wasn't just about trying to, you know, like they wanted to carry out a revolution in Egypt, but I think they wanted something much broader than that. Like they wanted a new world.
Hey everyone, welcome to The Field Between. My name is Ahmed,
I'm Yasmin.
and today we are really pleased to be joined by Rusha Latif, who is an Egyptian American researcher. Her work focuses on social movements and revolutions, particularly in the Middle East, with an emphasis on leadership, organization, and collective action across lines of class, gender, religion, and ideology. Her book, Tahrir's Youth, Leaders of a Leaderless Revolution, published by AUC Press in 2022, draws on ethnographic fieldwork in Cairo during the 2011 uprising to examine activist agency in the absence of formal leadership. Rusha, welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
And so obviously the thing we're here to talk about is the January 25th uprising in 2011. But before we get to the main events and everything that happens on the day and after, what your book does so well is tell like a very on the ground account of the events that led up to, not just in the days leading up to it, but in the decades leading up to the movement. And you specifically focus on the youth movement, and you make an important intervention, I think, which is, there's the narrative that everything that happened on January 11th was just this like spontaneous thing that erupted out of social media sites. And the intervention you make is like the leaderless movement and its horizontality like does not necessarily mean there weren't any leaders. And in fact, there's like kind of like a dialectical relationship between, the leaderlessness and the movement itself and the reactions that they elicit. So before we get started, just tell us a little bit about what brought you to this book project, and maybe you can touch a little bit on the methods you use.
Yes, thank you again for having me, Ahmed. So I was a graduate student when the revolution erupted in 2011 at UC Davis. I was studying community development, and I actually happened to be looking for a thesis topic at the time that dealt with the topics of social movements, youth, and leadership. And I really couldn't believe my luck when a revolution erupted. What I call back, my backyard. I'm originally from Egypt. My parents are from there. I was born and raised here in California, but I grew up going there, like a lot of Egyptians who grew up in diaspora. I even lived there for a few years after my undergraduate degree. I taught English and studied Arabic. And so I knew Egypt really well. And I was tremendously inspired by what I saw, just as I think citizens were around the globe. But I was also really intrigued with the way that the revolution was being framed, right? So for me, even though I had lived in Egypt, I would say that I wasn't really political. Uh, and it's funny because later on, as I, went and did all the research, a lot of the events that I talk about in the book were things that afterwards I recalled seeing, but I didn't really know what was happening because I was sort of living there as an expat, just having a different life. But so I was really inspired, and I really wanted to understand, like, what did I miss? How did this happen? And so the dominant media narrative at the time, I was actually scouring media for like answers, was that this was this spontaneous, leaderless uprising that was powered by social media. And of course, we heard a lot about like the Facebook revolution, right? The Twitter uprising. But then at the same time, you started to hear a lot of things about it being youth-led. And I found that tension really fascinating. Like, what does it mean for it to be leaderless and youth-led? Which one was it? How could it be both? So that was really the sort of the question mark that I had, and what drew me into this study. And at the same time, I mentioned I had actually just started to explore that literature on social movement and youth and leadership through a different project that I was trying to move away from because it kind of depressed me, to be honest. But it was actually, I was looking at the rise of Islamophobia in the US And sort of the flashpoint for that at the time, the late 2000s, remember this was a decade after 9/11, was the Ground Zero mosque controversy in New York City. And that was a time, I think, where this rhetoric against, Muslim Americans not belonging, there was a lot of otherization of Arabs and Muslims. And so within that context, the images coming out of Egypt were incredibly just captivating and really, I think, did something to the psyche of like me and a lot of other young Arabs and Muslims who grew up in the US, where, the kind of policies and movement against Muslims and Arabs was being fueled by a certain kind of image of like, what Arabs and Muslims are supposed to be, that we're backwards, that we're anti-democracy, right? All of these things. And so, the pull was, what was inspiring to me was like this uprising, but there was also a bit of a push from the US of me, in this context, trying to understand where I belonged in a time when there was this very strong rhetoric in the US that people like me didn't belong, right? So I think there was an element of me also trying to kind of find myself in that movement. And that story, I think, also comes out in the book. So in any case, I did travel to Egypt in June of 2011. And sure enough, I discovered that this framing was really reductive and that there was, in fact, leadership behind the movement, but it's not maybe the kind of leadership we would expect. It wasn't, there wasn't this charismatic figurehead. There wasn't really a clear vanguard organization, but there was definitely leadership happening. And the group that I think really helps us see that is the one that I profiled, which is the Revolutionary Youth Coalition.
Yeah.
And we can talk more about them and what they did as
Yeah.
we go along.
One of the images that you bring up early on in the book that you introduce to kind of illustrate just like the horizontality. There's like a banner that's held up that says no independent stage, no slogans or any political party or movement, and one mic. And so like I thought that was like a really interesting picture to just kind of like foreground the stage that we get to. And I also thought it was just like such a stark contrast to another hallowed and venerated day in America in January, which is January 6th, where like every person just kind of showed up with their own ideology and were just like making allusions to that. Like one's like, allegiance to QAnon, one's allegiance to Trump. And like, it's just, everyone has their own political, like bespoke political creation.
Yeah.
And I think, so you mentioned the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, which we'll definitely get to, and kind of like how it comes to be and how it, how it operates leading up to the revolution. But another thing that you do in the book is just like you go even farther back to kind of give a history and explanation of what were like the material conditions and the political conditions at a high level, just in the decades before, even going back to the 1950s and 60s. Do you think maybe it makes sense to just kind of just set that up from like the end of Gamal Abdel Nasser to Sadat to how Mubarak ascends, consolidates power, and then, in that environment, what does the terrain for political revolution or political action kind of look like?
Yeah, sure. So I think like Egyptian history is so complicated, right? There's so many moving parts. That was actually the hardest chapter for me to write, where I tried to lay all of that out, and probably why the book took so long to get out. Um, but I think the best way to kind of understand this history, and how we got to 2011 is through the lens of the social contract, which was forged in the 1950s, and then eroded over the next 6 decades, until it was until it eventually collapsed, right, under Mubarak. So that contract, as I mentioned, it came about after the fall of the monarchy, when like Nasser came to power and he was now the new, the leader of this new republic. And so he comes with promises of sovereignty and like dignity and economic prosperity for Egyptians, right? Jobs, education, healthcare, and subsidies. But the exchange for that is the people's political obedience, and they have to basically forfeit their rights. So, for a time there was this bargain and it worked. Nasser asserted Egyptian sovereignty by like nationalizing the Suez Canal in 1956. which effectively took away, its control from the British and French. And then he established Egypt as like the leader of this Arab nationalist movement, which at the time gave Egyptians a lot of pride. But at the same time, he had this whole like socialist welfare system that lifted millions of Egyptians into the middle class. Um, but the problem was like from the very beginning, he built authoritarianism into this regime that he was building. And we saw the first major kind of rupture happen to his project in 1967 with the defeat in the war with the Six-Day War with Israel, right?
Yeah.
So then we have Sadat come to power, and he shifts Egypt towards this towards economic liberalization with his policy that is known as al-infitah, the opening. And so through that, they begin to dismantle protections for, everyday Egyptians. They invited all this foreign investment into the country, and we started to see the elites become enriched on the tail of all of this. And so that eventually sparked the 1977 bread riots. Um, and then obviously there was like the peace with Israel that kind of shifted Egypt into the US orbit. And, that was an affront to a lot of Egyptians who saw that as a betrayal of solidarity, Arab solidarity, and specifically solidarity with Palestinians. And so the that anger found expression, you could say, in his assassination, right? Um, so then comes along Mubarak, and he doesn't reverse the model, right? He just entrenches it further with additional and deeper neoliberal reforms. Um, so under him, we started to see like, more privatization. We saw social protections getting dismantled, a rise in inequality, a lot more repression as he expanded the police state. And then, of course, he built deeper ties with US foreign policy and just US empire.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the setup of like what was happening over those 6 decades with the governments. But then, of course, Egyptians didn't, they didn't accept this. They didn't take this lying down. And it sounds like you want to say something, but I'm happy to
Oh,
kind
no,
of.
no. I was just going to say, like, totally. Yeah, that's a really good overview. And I think it kind of explains just the political climate in Egypt. As you said, like, after Sadat was killed by a member of Islamic Jihad,
Yeah.
um, Mubarak ascends and kind of consolidates power by taking these emergency powers that you mentioned in the book just were in effect essentially until 2011. So for the entirety of his like 30-year rule, it was like an emergency and it was a war on terror. Can you?
Yeah.
One of the groups that you also set up that I think offer an important history and kind of contrast to the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, which we'll get to in a bit. But one of the important groups also is the Muslim Brotherhood, and also just kind of like Mubarak's regimes, like how they address and see not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but just kind of like Islamists in general. And the other thing that you really set up is just the things that come up over and over in moments of rupture and revolution are bread riots in reaction to the worsening economic crisis due to that turn to neoliberalism and subordination to US policy. Palestine is another big Palestine solidarity, as well as like youth movements. But before we kind of like get into the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, could you, like I said, could you just like set up briefly the crackdown that is predicated on cracking down on Islamists?
Yeah, sure. Um, so if we're talking about like Islamists and maybe more specifically the Muslim Brotherhood, so the Muslim Brotherhood, we'll just maybe say up front, was Egypt's largest and most organized political opposition on the eve of the revolution. And if they of course have a long history in Egypt, along with other Islamist movements that kind of come up in the book, like Al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya, the Islamist group, which was sort of an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood was founded in 1928 and by the well-known figure Hassan al-Banna. Um, and so, I mean, if we're going to talk about like the history, like the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamist movements were a problem for regimes from the beginning, from Gamal Abdel Nasser. I mean, we saw him crack down on a lot of them. Many of the activists I interviewed had parents or grandparents who were members of the Muslim Brotherhood or even just perceived to be members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they got arrested and spent time in jail. Um, and, so we saw that happen under Mubarak. We also, in Sadat, there was a little bit of room that under Sadat, he gave him a little bit of extra room to operate. And this was sort of as a way of trying to shift away from like Nasser's sort of state socialist project. He thought if he could empower the Islamists together and kind of present himself as somebody that was, slightly more aligned with them, that they would kind of form a bulwark against the leftist movements, especially like a lot of them are kind of active on like university campuses. So there was that space, but that eventually backfired as he kept moving into this closer into the U.S. orbit, and of course signed the peace agreement with Israel, the Camp David peace accords, and that was in the late 70s, and that was what caused his assassination, right? He
Mhm.
was assassinated by an Islamist from I believe it was from the Jama'ah. And then, of course, we started, when Mubarak takes power, he just kind of continues the emergency laws that I believe that Nasser Sadat had instituted at one point anger continued to mount in Egypt in the lead up to the Accords or right after it. Excuse me for like my spotty memory of
No,
what
no,
I
this is
the chapter.
all great.
Um, and then, yeah, and so Mubarak basically takes over, and I don't know. I think from what I recall, I believe that he, dispensed with the emergency laws for a brief time, but I think that was very brief. And pretty much for all of his tenure in power, Egypt was under emergency law. And so,
And I just want to say, this is like just as I was reading the book, it just like so. I've come up with this term theory that I'm trying to coin. It's like the Egyptification of the U.S. There are just like so many things that
yeah,
you read and you're like, oh, this is exactly what's happening here, from like
yeah,
the Boltegeia and just like the slums, or quote slums,
yeah,
doing surveillance on people, and then the obviously like the emergency powers consolidation is just like so similar to the US war on terror that's like been going on since 2001 or 2003, and like I don't think we've won it.
no,
It's still going on, and also just like more and more deregulation and neoliberalization of the economy, turning people into like you know making them like so desperate, and there's just like doesn't seem like there's any hope, and there's just
yeah,
like this dormancy that people need to wake up to. But anyway, like just throughout the book, I feel like this is so instructive for
yeah.
anyone in the US who is now just like in panic mode because of more ICE and National Guard in the street and in their neighborhoods.
Absolutely. I see those parallels myself. And I think, yeah, I think this book is a particularly, it's a case study of how this unfolded in a different country, right? You could kind of see the process of how this happened.
Yeah.
And like you just mentioned, like, this, thinking about like ICE and just security forces and how that happens. I mean, um, as regime, so Mubarak continues, not only does he have emergency law, but he continues to really build out the police state and its apparatus, right? And so he dramatically increased the number of paramilitary troops,
Mhm.
and of course the opposition was kind of the target of that. But before that, so you mentioned like in the 90s, there was this period of um, you know Islamist groups who were there was a whole crackdown, right, as part of like you know just trying to maintain order in Egypt. And there was several incidents of, what are framed as like terror incidents that involved like t tourists to Egypt. But we saw in the 90s this like major crackdown on on Islamists in particular. And so that's when you started to see there was like the street kind of became silent around that time because it wasn't just limited. Inevitably, they have one target, right, which is like the Islamists, and they make it about them, but they use those opportunities to expand the net more widely
Yeah.
and down on any group, right? So,
Yeah.
but then what happened was in the early 2000s, in the year 2000, was the Second Palestinian Intifada, the eruption of that. And that was a turning point for Egypt and the activist and resistance and movement scene.
Yeah, I think that's a good fast forward to kind of set up, you know, the activity that happens in the 2000s, especially just kind of what's going on with, you know, university students. And your book mentions also like, you know, the textile workers, et cetera. But I think that's a great point to start setting up the youth coalitions.
Yeah, sure. So so as I mentioned, like I was really trying to get to the bottom of like, was this a spontaneous leaderless uprising or were there people behind it and what were their stories? And so obviously I developed one of the well, it became very clear that this like social movement narrative was really reductive. And the problem it had in uh, something, I mean, maybe obviously for me, I'm from the Silicon Valley, so just like the whole social media thing, and I was like, really, the agents of the revolution were like local, like it felt a little bit off, right? And so I really wanted to understand like how did this happen? And so when I got to Egypt, I was a couple of things happened. One was I was trying to figure out like who do I talk to, right? And I had a sense of like, okay, of who the leaders were based on, because as I mentioned, I was like kind of scouring media and I was trying to kind of find names and stuff. And so
I
early
gotta
on, I found,
ask, sorry, yeah,
yeah,
I gotta ask because like this is you're doing this in like, I mean, maybe it wasn't as bad because it wasn't like post or you're saying this is this post 2011 that you're doing this work or is it
In
before?
yeah, it's
2011.
like right
Okay,
after the
right.
uprising.
Yeah, so like you're doing this in a like how, right? Like gathering the names and asking around like this is just like such a moment of just like heightened paranoia and like yeah,
Yeah,
just how did you find people?
I mean, that's really good that you mentioned paranoia. I mean, because there was a lot of, I mean, that's why I have a whole chapter in my book just even talking about my methodology because I figured, I mean, there's a lot of things that come up when you're studying a revolution, especially if you're talking about leaders. Like people want to know, like, why are they the leaders and not other groups? I mean, there's a lot of groups. One of the things I found is that, like, when I went to Tahrir, when I arrived in late June, a week after there was a new occupation or a sit-in in Tahrir. It was like the July 8th protests, and that one lasted for 3 weeks. So I was really lucky in that like all the activists were there and very accessible for me to start like networking with. But one of the things I quickly realized is that I couldn't like everybody when I just asked who were the leaders of the movement, like everybody, like a lot of different people were like, well, there's no leaders. There was like ego and competition, and so there were some people that were I understood to be leaders and later found out were not, and even maybe it was their mental health was questionable, right? So there was a lot of kind of weird dynamics that I had to navigate, and so I felt like I really had to like clarify that in the book so that people understood how I came to the decision to focus on the RYC and why I thought they were like an important group. But like early on, before I even got to the RYC, I was like just looking on different media outlets before I came to Egypt, who were the names that were coming out, and who were the names that folks were like leaning to media outlets on like Facebook and Twitter. So this was just based on who was being profiled in the media. And when I got to Egypt and asked, about those folks and whether I should interview them, I learned that a lot of them were actually politicized by the revolution and weren't active really politically before it or like organizing in a deep way. So I was like, huh, that's very interesting that like the media's sort of pushing these groups to the forefront. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that they spoke English.
Hmm.
It was, but a lot of the groups that were actually really heavily involved in organizing on the ground before January 25th and actually strategizing for it didn't speak English and they didn't get that kind of coverage, right? And so the Revolutionary Youth Coalition was one of those groups, and I would say the main group. Um, so I asked around to find out who, was this spontaneous or was there a planning? Like, what was the planning for it, and who should I talk to? And I was eventually directed to the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, I sat down one evening with the activist Ola Shahba, who's profiled in my book, in front of the Mugamma building and Tahrir, if you guys know that big ugly building, that bureaucratic building. And we were just on the grass one night, and she pulled out a cigarette. She's like, "No, no, no, there was planning, and this is what happened." And she told me this story of this like incredible secret strategy and protest march that they organized out of uh, an area, sort of a popular quarter on the outskirts of Cairo called Bulak al-Dakrur. And that's when I heard that story, it totally floored me. One, I was like, how come I didn't hear this before? Like nobody's talked about this incredible, like, planning and strategy that these activists had. And then the second thought was like, well, this completely undermines this narrative that this was leaderless. There was definitely people who were acting with intentionality and thinking about like how do we bring out masses onto the streets, and the tactics and strategies they developed came out of an experience that preceded the revolution, and it was honed in those a whole decade, starting with the Palestinian Intifada, right? So
Yeah.
taking us back to that conversation, that part of the conversation. So in the year 2000, you had the Intifada, and this was not there was no social media at the time. I mean, I think there was like I don't know if that was when the blogging started. That might have been a few years after. There was like a whole kind of blogging
It
movement
was
in
around that
Egypt.
time, yeah.
Yeah, but all of these like images out of Palestine were live streamed through like Al Jazeera, right, which was like on the rise at the time, these satellite television channels. And so that sent shockwaves through the region, like, and especially Egypt. And they were really stunned by their government's inability to kind of do anything about it, or their perceived helplessness. But later they started to see it as complicity. And so people went into the streets in solidarity, and especially students. I think a lot of these protests started on student university campuses, which again is like a very remarkable parallel to like the student uprisings we had here in the year 2024, in solidarity with like Gaza. So that was kind of the first wave. There was a lot of like, protests on the streets for the first time, and the regime did give them that kind of like open the valve a bit to give them some room to steam. They didn't really perceive this as a threat because they thought, well, this is all about like Israel and stuff. It's not directed at us. But the activists, or just, common Egyptians, also started to make connections between, the kind of repression they were experiencing in Egypt and, what was happening in Palestine, that these things were not disconnected. They were very much related. And so they started to turn their anger very quickly on the regime. And I think even like Hussam al-Hamalawi talks about how for the first time he heard for the call, chants against Mubarak on university campuses. And so then that was what followed. That was the Iraq War movement, that happened globally, but it also happened in Egypt. And so you started to see like groups and organizations come together across ideological differences. And so together, these kind of form that first resistance wave that we saw in Egypt in the 2000s, early 2000s, around regional struggles. But that now opened a space for resistance directly against the regime and like the push for democracy. So that's when we saw like the rise of the Kifaya movement. And then the third wave was around, and these waves kept building on each other on the space that they were opening, right? There was one around an explosive labor struggle,
Hmm.
and that emerged with um, the textile workers in the city of Mahalla rising up, and we saw like movements, that were non-labor movements emerge in solidarity. And then the fourth wave happened around like police brutality. And of course, the flashpoint for that was the police killing of Khalid Said in the city of Alexandria in broad daylight. And this was a young middle class man who, typically wouldn't have been. It was the first time really that I think Egyptians saw like a middle class man be the target of police repression that way. And it really shook that layer of Egyptian society.
And I
And so
can't
we started
help
to,
but pause on that for a little bit and just
yeah,
again note the parallel of that and the woman who was just murdered by ICE in
yeah,
Minneapolis. And,
yeah.
you know, again, these moments of rupture and uh, the very obvious similarities between Egypt and the US right now.
Mhm.
I think now that we have
Yeah.
all this helpful background established, I want to hone in a little bit on like what is the majority of your book, which is dedicated to the specific group, the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, and the role that they played in sort of getting off the ground the January 25th, 2011 uprising that ended up ultimately culminating in Mubarak being removed from office, which was extraordinary. I mean, after decades of being in power. So could you tell us a
Yeah.
little bit, and I think you've gestured towards this already, but sort of about the organizing model of the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, how it came to be. You've got some really interesting reflections in the book also on the demographics of the movement, that it's mostly men, that it's mostly Muslim, but that it does include some women, that it includes some Coptic Christians who make up about 10% of Egypt's population. So we'd love to just hear about like who's in the movement and what does this particular coalition look like?
Yeah, sure. So let me just go back to how, so just it's because this is actually related to what I was just sharing about these four different waves.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of gives us really good context for understanding the emergence of the Revolutionary Youth Coalition. So the activists from this group, and I'll get to the demographics, their demographics in a moment, but they kind of emerged out of this 10-year history, right? So in those first two waves I mentioned, those, the kind of political organizations that were emerging, the sort of movement itself was being driven by an older generation. I mean, you did again have student protesters, but there was also like more senior figures who were kind of leading some of the movement. And so those were like, from the 67 generation of the student movement or the 73 generation. These are like different political generations in Egypt. And these activists, I think, that we saw, that were later animating the January 25th movement, they were first politicized and activated during those two waves,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're just now getting socialized into activism. But in the second two waves, they're the ones that are now like establishing establishing movements and like leading them. And they're also coming up with new protest strategies and tactics that were different from what the sort of their elders had previously done. So there was a lot of criticism amongst the activists that their kind of way of protest was a little bit elitist. It was targeting kind of sort of maybe the educated classes of Egyptian society. A lot of their protests were being held at like government downtown buildings, which were kind of inaccessible to like the majority of Egyptians who lived like in popular quarters. So the activists, they were like, well, change isn't going to happen this way. It's only going to happen if we bring like the masses into the movement. So their tactics, they shifted towards trying to bring the movement to them in their spaces. So that's when we saw the development of a lot of things like flash protests in popular neighborhoods where they would come with posters and signs and sometimes creative actions like bringing pots and pans and banging them, things like that, whistles, and they would chant about issues that concern people in those areas, mostly socioeconomic issues. And those were like really quick flash protests. They had to be conscious of police who dominated those neighborhoods. And so those tactics were really important because that was now forming their repertoire of like action, right? That they were drawing on for the uprising. So getting those understanding kind of what happened in that period is really important to understanding the emergence of the coalition. So on January 25th, which is the day of action, uh, across, so January 25th was Police Day in Egypt. And that was a day that they had normally protested on for years, since at least 2009 when Mubarak instituted it as as Police Day, as a day as a day to kind of like thank the police and commemorate them. And then
I'm
so the
surprised Trump
activists,
hasn't done that yet. That's a good move.
I
it's
mean,
probably
his
going to
birthday
come.
is now basically a national holiday. So,
Oh,
I
that's
know
true.
that's right. But so essentially, they were like, okay, we're going to appropriate this holiday and use it to protest the police state. And so they had that plan to do that on January 25th, as they did every year. But what changed the game this time was Tunisia. Tunisia had they had their own uprising, and everybody in the region was watching it very closely. And they ousted their leader, and that was the first time we saw like an Arab dictator get removed from power by the people. And so naturally, it exhilarated not just Egyptians, but people across the region. And suddenly, this day of protest, the activists were planning took on like a new era of possibility, right? So, as I mentioned, there was different youth groups that actually maybe I didn't clarify this, but the Revolutionary Youth Coalition was comprised of different youth movements that subscribed to different ideological leanings. So you had leftist liberals and Islamists, namely Youth from the Muslim Brotherhood. And that just kind of mirrored the dynamics of the 10-year resistance movement before that, where you had, in all of those different spaces, you had the convergence of, or the coming together of activists from different orientations to figure out, how to like address the crisis in the region, or how to, effectively push for democracy. Everybody kind of came around their shared belief in that like the status quo couldn't hold, right? And so you saw a lot of like coordination and movement building across ideological difference. So that was the case with the networks that made up the movements that made up the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, who at the time had not named them as such, themselves as such. That came later. At the time of on the eve of the uprising, they were just a loose network of activist groups. So they decide, well, here comes this day of protest. What if maybe we can step up our game a little bit? And so there was this air of possibility that maybe they could have a revolution, right? But I don't think anybody really believed it was possible at the time, because like Mubarak was so deeply entrenched, like like nobody really thought it would, that
And you
he was
capture
something
that really, just to interject really quickly, you capture that really beautifully in the book, just like that there's this moment and people are so excited that there are so many people in the street, like thousands more than they anticipated. I think they were hoping for 1,000, and on January 25th in Cairo, they get like 5,000. And then there's this moment you just like can't really go back. Like it's kind of beyond even their wildest dreams.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So that was like a really important, yeah, you're telling the story of like what they actually did on January 25th, which was they started to figure out like, okay, let's see what we can do to just get even more people in the streets than we normally would. So they took from those tactics and strategies that they had been developing in the years before, and they tried to like step it up. And they came up with this like secret strategy that involved having, announcing like 20 protest locations online across Egypt for January 25th, but that those activist groups would bring their peers secretly to a secret 21st location, and they would mobilize a march from there. And so they chose this popular quarter in Burak al-Dakrur, like this little bakery shop that had this little like plaza right in front of it. It was a very densely populated area. What their thinking was like, we need to get not just like, we need people across classes. We definitely need the working class poor whose grievances are going to animate the struggle. And without their participation, we don't really have a strong movement. And then obviously we need to get people from the upper classes as well. So the beauty of the strategy was that it helped them start from that first group and pull out people and then connect them, the kind of march that they had planned from the secret neighborhood to one of those 20 protest location sites that they announced on January 25th. It tied these two areas together. It tied Bulak al-Dakrur to Mohandesin, if you're familiar with that area. So they actually, they pulled out this huge march down like Arab League Street, and the activists couldn't believe the numbers of people that responded and came out. And of course, they were very careful in the mobilizing frames. So the chants revolved around, when they were trying to call people to join their protest, they were like not talking about Mubarak, right? They were talking about socioeconomic concerns like the price of bread, like the fact that they couldn't, afford to buy furniture, and they had all kinds of really great chants, and people joined them, and a lot more than they thought. But the beauty of this strategy was that by announcing these 20 locations online, they effectively decoyed the police to those locations, which meant that the police that normally dominate those neighborhoods weren't around. And so that's why they were able to like get that many people out before like the police caught wind of them.
Yeah.
So that was what got they called it the snowball. That was an intentional strategy that they built it up. And when they got to Mohandesin, I mean, they just were like overwhelmed with the number of people and said things like, it was like people were exploding from beneath the ground. But they get to Mohandesin and they were like, okay, well, we have to go. Now this is where like that kind of the spontaneity comes in, which is like, we can't drop the ball now, we have to keep going. And this to me is like a really fascinating moment. So they decide that they're going to lead this march to Tahrir. This march becomes the one so there's like veins of protesters coming in from all of these different locations to Tahrir that day. But this is the one that brings in the critical mass that leads to the game-changing siege of the square, right? And so for me, what I often tell people is like, if they didn't do what they did, I don't see how we would have had an Egyptian revolution, or even an Arab uprising. That's me. But even just the Arab Spring, like, because that was really the main catalyst. They brought tons of people out into the street. Not tons, but I mean, their estimates were like as large as 80,000. We have no way, obviously, of knowing exactly, but just the fact that they were citing numbers that big, I think really tells you that it was really a game-changing moment.
I think
So
it's
from there,
immense. I
yeah.
think, just to comment really quickly on, like, again, the one of the main things that your book does is push back on the narrative that this was just like an unplanned thing, which I think, a lot of Western media outlets tell to kind of say like, oh, these people aren't capable of like a revolution that would then transition into like a stable power or anything like that. Like, they don't know what they're doing, and they have essentially have no vision for their own futures. Is just kind of how that gets spun. But yeah, here you are, like, talking about the days and weeks leading up to January 25th. And yes, it did. We're going to talk about the snowball a little bit more, but
Yeah.
there is just kind of like this such an intentional, like, neighborhood level organizing that is critical to organizing, and strategy that is just critical to the success of kind of like leading to this rupture. And
Yeah.
no, yeah, you're right. Like, I also think it's, just to comment on, like, it is really interesting that, um, you know, again, another central thing to the book is that, and we'll talk about it in a bit, is, like, January 25th was just like unfolded as this dialectical process, like neither
Mhm.
adhering to a structure, uh nor entirely like spontaneous, but it was just like a tension that needed to be resolved in the moment. And in that moment, the cries of like of going from talking about the bread prices and like general political discontent to like specifically coming to the demand that Mubarak leave. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think maybe that's a good setup for you to kind of maybe get into the demands and like what is erupting out of how this grew and what erupts out of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, those are great points. I think, I mean, that moment, that turning point for me when they get to Mohandesin is just really interesting because that's when, like you said, this dialectic kind of like takes over. And I think it's just really instructive for us because they didn't have a plan beyond getting all the people out into the streets.
Mhm.
I think nobody really anticipated that many would come out. And the other thing that happened was as like the people kind of took over, they're the ones that started chanting the chant from Tunisia, which is the people want the fall of the regime, right? الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام.
Mhm.
That didn't come from the activists, it came from the people. And now that the people were, demanding that, the activists were like, well, we can't demand less, we can't pull back, we have to keep pushing this. So to me, it's a fascinating moment because, like I said, so the revolutionaries are often criticized for not like providing leadership to the movement or structure or clarity of like what they want, but I think you have to like understand how it unfolded for them in real time and be fair.
Mhm.
Like there was no possibility for that from what they could see before January 25th 2011. Like it wasn't, that wasn't in the prospect. There wasn't any model like that they could follow, right? Like this was the first major revolutionary movement that we at least saw kind of unfold on our TV screens. That's why it's one of the reasons why it's such a historic moment when we think about movements in the 21st century. And so they were kind of the first movers, right? On like, can you have a revolution in the 21st century? Like, because I think that idea was sort of dead. I mean, obviously, like Tunisians were the first to kind of open up our imagination to the possibility, but really, you needed another group to actually give it some sort of a proof of concept, right? And so that was the Egyptians, one of the largest, most populated countries in the Arab region. And so the fact that they got on the bandwagon was like a really big deal. But so looking at the activists and trying to understand, like, okay, you know, not expecting this political opportunity, this opening on January 25th, and not being prepared for it, how did they then try to run with that opening? And what do we learn from it, right? And that's where I start to like really try to say, like, let's not judge what they did, or judge them. I mean, I think we're past that moment. I think in the years after we could do that, but like 15 years on, I think it's really useful to look at this more as like an experiment to understand, you know, in these unknown circumstances, what did they try to do and what were the challenges that they faced? Because I think those can be really important starting points for like imagining new ways forward for our movements.
Yeah.
I think that's smart. And like hindsight's 2020. I think just for for listeners who are less familiar with this history, I guess maybe the judgment comes from the fact that like when ultimately there was success and Mubarak was removed, that it seems like more establishment figures kind of stepped in, right? That there wasn't that much planning for like the day after. But as you're describing this kind of tension, like it was almost beyond everyone's imagination that there could be a day after.
Mm-hmm.
And there were such repressive conditions. And it was so incredible that this uprising sort of happened in the first place. Is that sort of what you're getting at in terms of like when you're referring to judgment?
Yeah, exactly. It's incredible that it happened in the first place. Like nobody really imagined that it was possible. And so now that it was there, what do we do with it? Like, how do we do this? Right.
Not only
And I
is
think
the outcome remarkable, sorry, but like, yeah, exactly. Like the outcome, yeah, I think people often understate how remarkable what happened. Like the thing that happened is just like the people actually rose up and demanded that their dictator step down in a highly militarized police state that is just like had been oppressing them for 30 years. And he left. And it was done with quite a sophisticated neighborhood level organizing operation. It's like yes, there are critiques to be made. There are some, lessons learned that you get to in your book and we'll get to later. But like, yeah, it's just like, it is a remarkable thing that happened. Despite what, takes place unfortunately in the 15 years after.
Before we get into that after, I think, I kind of agree with this need to sort of dwell on the actual moment itself. Can we still talk a little bit more about like, just because it is the focus of your book, like when did the Revolutionary Youth Coalition take on that name and sort of like who are the actors that are involved? How are they defining themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad that you asked that because that's sort of what I was trying to get out with, like trying to understand this as an experiment, and looking at it through that lens. So as I mentioned, the activists, in that moment on January 25th, when all of those people came out into the street, um, one of the activists told me that the question, that they were like asking themselves when they got to Mustafa Mahmoud Square, and that was really the extent of their strategy, right? They didn't have really a solid plan for going to Tahrir that day, but they had all these people, right? And so he was like, we were asking ourselves, like, what do we do with all of these people? And I really love that question, because I think it captures like the shock of the activists on that day and like the dilemma that they found themselves in on January 25th, because with this unexpected success of their mass action and now this revolutionary situation, it suddenly gave way to that they weren't expecting. Something was happening to them that they weren't expecting, which is their status was suddenly changing and unexpectedly from activists to revolutionaries. And they're now trying to figure out, like, what does that actually mean, right? So again, because none of them had really like imagined the possibility of revolution in Egypt, a lot of them dreamt of it, right? But that's very different from like actually thinking it's possible. And so when it came, they were really like unprepared when it was there right in front of them. And a lot of this had to do with, again, like the eradication of political space under Mubarak, which meant that they didn't really have like the opportunity to engage in like real political life and develop any kind of like political acumen beyond like protesting. At least, and at least at the level that's needed for this moment, right? And so now they're trying to figure out like what role should we play, if any, as like leaders in this nascent revolutionary struggle. And so I think again of that quote by Tariq, and another reason why I really love it is because it reminds me of a question, sort of the question that the activists from the left have long asked themselves, right? And this goes back to like celebrated revolutionary strategists like Lenin and Luxemburg and others from like the Marxist tradition, which is like this question of, can the masses carry out a revolution spontaneously on their own, or do they need like leaders to organize them, right? And so you had like Lenin, the Lenin school of thought, which is like, no, they can't do it on their own, and they need like guidance and leadership from professional revolutionaries who are like part of this, highly disciplined and very centralized hierarchical vanguard organization. And then somebody like Luxembourg, who was like, no, that's elitist, and the masses can naturally become leaders naturally through their own engagement with the struggle. So what we start to see is like how they kind of implicitly engage in these questions. And then from there, we start to see like a process kind of play out that I think, I can get into more related to like how the Revolutionary Youth Coalition coalesced in response to these questions.
Tell us about the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, kind of like in the aftermath of 2011.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, it's good to like look at it in two sort of phases, right? So there was, in the beginning of the kind of 18 days, so let me actually start. So the Revolutionary Youth Coalition themselves actually didn't name themselves as such until like 10 days into the uprising. And I'll talk a little bit about like what happened right before that led them to make the decision. And then maybe if you want, we could talk about the challenges they faced after. So in the beginning, as they were trying to like negotiate this question of should we step to the forefront as leaders or not, they were like, no, we're just gonna like lead from behind the scenes. And they were engaging in something that I like to describe as like performing leaderlessness, right? And so this is where we start to get to the bottom of like complicating this question of leadership and leaderlessness. There were several reasons for this, right? The first had to do with just like the, this horizontal decentralized nature of their movement, which like carried over from like the previous period. So the activists, remember, their status changed from activists to revolutionaries, but like what remained constant was this like decentralized movement structure that they had formed in the years before. And so just as that like horizontal structure kind of enabled a lot of them to kind of easily come into the movement and act autonomously and creatively as leaders, right? It was sort of doing the same thing for now, like the thousands of Egyptians who were coming into the movement, right? So many people were suddenly coming in, and now this starts to constrain the activists and how they can show up as leaders, right? So the more the movement grew, you were now having like a people's movement, and it felt to them like it wasn't appropriate for them to proclaim to be its leaders because, again, this was a mass people's movement. And then they were like, well, I mean, even if we wanted to claim leadership, like the movement would have lashed out against them. It was kind of against the movement culture that was emerging because they saw that its leaderlessness is what gave it its legitimacy, right? And so there was this almost like obsession with this idea of leaderlessness. And so that was kind of the image that they promoted, not just the protesters in the square, but also the activists, that this was leaderless. There were no leaders behind this, right? And then there was also another dynamic, which is like, if they were to call themselves as leaders, they would be basically putting a target on their own backs, right? Like,
right.
You can't proclaim that kind of visibility in that moment. And also there was a fear that like, if they were to say that they were the leaders, this would make it easy for like the regime to frame this as like a movement that's being plotted by like some tiny subversive group, foreign hands, all of these things, right? And so they were like, no, there's no leaders. That's sort of the way to go here. And then there was this question of like, what does it even mean to like lead a revolutionary movement? Like nobody had done it before. They didn't have a model, right? They didn't know what kind of commitment they were shouldering by making that proclamation. Are they calling themselves like, okay, now we're going to step in and take over a government? Like, nobody was, these were kind of like middle class, remember, youth and like university students. So there was a lot of ambiguity that they were wrestling with. That was all up until like a really critical moment, which was the Battle of the Camel, if you guys remember that incident. That was when we started to see, or they started to see that this wasn't actually going to work. It was a violent episode in which the regime sent thugs into the square. And it was, to basically beat them down and dismantle the square. So there were these violent clashes between the protesters that were occupying Tahrir and these figures. And at that time, right after, there was this group of opposition figures that came together and they formed themselves into something they called the Council of Wise Men, which, as you can imagine, was very triggering for like the young people and the women, right? And so they were like, let me fash, or like, okay, that's when they realized
wise men got us into this problem. Wise men will get us out of this problem. Okay.
Yeah. And so they were just like, they couldn't, because this was a very youthful movement, right?
Right.
It had all people from all across society, but So that's when they realized, okay, we need some kind of like official group that's going to claim to represent the radical position of the square. And that was the only way they saw for it to protect it from like being undermined and like demobilized and sold out. So they announced the Revolutionary Youth Coalition. This was on February 6th. And the first proclamation, if you guys remember it, was like لا تفاوض قبل الرحيل. There's no negotiations before the departure. And so they insisted that they were going to continue to occupy the square until their demands were met. And so in that moment, they become like the closest thing to a revolutionary like vanguard in the square. And then we could talk about like, well, so then the question after that was like, how do we, people were like, yes, we do need some kind of organization, but this group isn't, it's not representative enough, right? It's still a small group. And the RYC themselves didn't proclaim representation on behalf of everybody in the square, only their groups, because they thought that was the safest, right? And so they say that maybe they made up about like 10%. And so they were like, well, in order to move forward, we have to like build wider consensus across all of the different kind of political groups that are present in the square for this to be actually like democratic and, you know, prefigurative, which is like, we have to kind of implement in our movement the model that we want to see kind of emerge like nationally, right? In terms of like what a democratic government would look like. So basically they have to like now institute this like wider consensus amongst all these opposition forces. But again, that takes time, right? And it was getting urgent that they figure out how to do this quickly because, well, now Mubarak, it's clear that he might step down. They don't have any kind of group or front that could claim power on behalf
Sorry,
of
I want to quickly interject there too. I was really surprised in your book. I didn't realize how many people kind of like last minute felt sympathetic for Mubarak as he was like clearly making these appeals to be like, okay, I'll leave, just let me finish my last like term, which like, I mean, his quote unquote term had already been decades. And that seemed to be like a pretty big generational shift too, or split rather, right? In terms of like who felt sympathetic towards him and towards who was sort of like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. That actually happened on the eve of the Battle of the Camel, where people were he gave that speech. I mean, he kind of shot himself in the foot with the Battle of the Camel because if he hadn't sent in those thugs, I think people would have started to leave the square. He gave this whole speech about like, they called it like the sentimental speech about, like you said, how he had served the country. And they're like, you know, Egyptians were like, no, don't humiliate him. Like, just let him serve out his term. He already said he's going to leave. And so they were calling their kids in the square and telling them to come home. And so the activists were really anxious that the square was going to get, you know, that night was actually a pretty empty night, like relatively compared to the nights before in the square. And then like the thugs came out and now it shifted popular opinion back in their favor. And so after that, you had a ton of people come out into the square again. So there's this like really fascinating dynamics that unfolded that the activists had to constantly like negotiate as they were trying to figure out how to drive this forward, but just how fickle public opinion was and how much that shaped the dynamics in those 18 days. But yeah, so I mentioned they had to figure out like how to build like a wider organization. And, you know, as they were trying to figure that out, some new kind of dynamics emerged, right? Which is the first was that they kind of like, you know, as young people, like we see these kind of like intergenerational tensions that emerge and questions of like the limits of what they can do as youth. So one of the constraints that they ran up against was like the fact that they lacked political experience in senior rank. And so they were like, okay, in order to overcome this, we have to bring kind of like the old guard into some kind of a revolutionary coalition. And then there was like these tensions that surfaced in their dialogues with them because I think a lot of the old guard figures in that moment felt really upstaged by the young people. And there was like this friction that emerged from that I think really hindered efforts to produce leadership and build revolutionary organizations in that moment. And then again, this like consensus building process, right, was just really time consuming. The activists were really committed to that process for collective decision making. But it took a lot of time, right? It didn't really match the urgency of the revolutionary moment that they were in. And so that's something that I find really interesting because, you know, horizontalism, democratic practice, these were things that were seen as like before January 25th, like really great, but those were like in a different context, right? That was like in a non-revolutionary context. In a revolutionary one, it doesn't exactly work because you also have the elite who are trying to make moves to shut down this protest, right?
Right.
This
You don't
movement.
have like infinite time,
You don't have a ton
unfortunately.
of time,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's actually what happened, right? So at the end of the day, the revolutionaries were outmaneuvered by SCAF. They basically took power before the movement, the revolutionary movement, could like coordinate and seize it themselves, in the form of like some kind of a, like a popularly backed civilian-led transitional government, or something else, right? So these were kind of the dynamics that happened in the 18 days, and then they carry over into what we call the transition period, which I believe was like 18 months after that, before before Morsi was elected president. Um, but now they're even more complicated, these dynamics, because now that Mubarak's out of the picture, like the revolutionaries sort of lose the common cause that unified them.
Hmm.
And they now have to deal with SCAF being power. They now have to deal with the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood, basically throwing them under the bus. And so they were just basically out organized in that moment. And I think, you know, like I say, to be fair, they were put in this situation where they had to build a plane as they were flying it,
Hmm.
like, right? And so it was just really hard to get ahead of their opponents.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, say what you will about maybe their failure in coming to like consensus on a vision for the future, but I like that you really mentioned in a section of the book, you mentioned that I guess Hillary Clinton had made a visit and wanted to meet with the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, and they
Yeah,
had the foresight to just outright reject the meeting with Hillary, which I
yeah,
love that they do that. And they issued some like pretty damning statements too.
they do. I mean, they were pretty radical in those in their statements in that period. Again, anti-imperialism was like core to their movement. That was like from its inception in the year 2000. Uh, so definitely it came out in the revolution. And one of the things that I often share with people is that like just even solidarity with Palestine, like how that played out during the revolution. I mean, the activists themselves, described them like imagine themselves kind of like, they thought a lot about how when they were throwing rocks at the police, like the imagery that came to mind were like the Palestinian kids throwing rocks at tanks, right?
Yeah.
So there were all these like parallels that we see, and that was very core to the movement. So definitely anti-imperial, definitely, anti-US government, not like the people. But that was central to the movement.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is a good segue to kind of like kind of the interview heavy portion of the book toward the end, where you kind of really talk about the vision for the future. You go back and revisit in some interviews with some of the activists, like how, they feel in retrospect, and talk a little bit about the, kind of like what we alluded to earlier is just like they're within all this tension and everything kind of like this whole dialectic kind of resolving in the moment, the participants like subjectivity and their transformation, and like there were transformations in how they relate to themselves, to movements along like gender and class and religion, etc. um
Mhm.
could you maybe just like hit on some of the things that you discovered in these interviews, and why is this important to understand?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Before I do that, I wanted to answer a question by Yasmin, because I know you wanted to like
Yep.
just a little bit more about the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, their demographics, and I think that's a good setup for this answer. So, as I mentioned, they consolidated, on February 6th, about 10 days into the uprising, and they formed like an executive leadership committee, made up of I'm not going to remember the exact number right now, but it was at least 12 leaders, if not more. And most of them were men. There was one woman who also happened to be the only Christian in the group. Um, and they, as I mentioned, subscribed to different ideologies. They had leftists, liberals, and Islamists, namely youth from the Muslim Brotherhood. And that latter point, I think, is really important, because there's very interesting dynamics that unfold, between the Revolutionary Youth Coalition and the Muslim Brotherhood, because of the participation of some of its youth in this movement. And they joined, kind of the planning for January 25th. Kind of, I don't want to say against the will of the organization. They went to them beforehand and said, we want to join, and they said, you can join as like just private citizens, but not as representatives of our organization. But as the movement got off, they kind of like, joined the bandwagon, so to
Mhm.
speak. And that's why there was a lot of frustration and anger towards them, because they acted very opportunistically, right?
Yeah.
And in the end, they played a huge role in derailing the movement. Um, so, and eventually the tensions were so high between the youth in this group and the broader leadership of the movement that they actually um, were kind of banished from the Muslim Brotherhood, right? So these are like very interesting dynamics that I got to actually observe because I was, in Egypt when a lot of this stuff happened. Um, but yeah, to answer your question, so I had part of my research. Okay, so just to be clear, I should have maybe said this in the beginning. Like I structure the book around uh, interviews and the narratives of 10 activists from this group, from the leadership of this group. And I did like deep interviews with them. I also, because I was in Tahrir, I followed them around a lot for like the 6 months that I was there. So there was a lot of observation, and that actually really worked out in my favor because I wasn't there in the early uprising, but I saw parallels with like things they were describing that happened early on, like in the present when I was there observing like events unfold. So it worked out to have kind of some kind of visual lens on like, oh, this is what they meant when they said there were these kinds of challenges and whatnot. Um, so that's how the book is structured. And basically, I interviewed it. There's two dimensions to this book. One is I'm trying to understand the eruption of the revolution through like the personal stories of these activists, right? Like how did it start and how did it end up getting defeated? So, and then through the 18-day uprising, so how they kind of came, were first politicized themselves, and then they came together in these activist groups, and then they were involved in the uprising and sort of emerged at the forefront as leaders. And then we started to see like that they were transformed by this movement, right? Up until the end, until the movement was defeated. And then, so that's kind of like the anthropological layer through life histories. And then the second one is sort of more sociological, where I'm trying to understand their emergence as a group, the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, how they advanced the revolution and uprising during the 18-day period, and then why they were, what were the challenges they faced until the movement was ultimately defeated. So that's kind of like the organizational level of trying to understand what happened in the movement. But there was this moment where I felt like it, as I was collecting my interviews, I'm like, I really wanted to understand, like, because there's a saying that like with a revolutionary movement, the one kind of change that you can be sure of is that the people who participate in them change, right? So you can't guarantee like the outcome of the revolution, but you can definitely guarantee that the participants will change, right? And so that's the question of their subjective transformation that I was really interested, because that has to happen alongside developments, right? Like they become like more courageous, they start to understand their masculinity and femininity differently, all these kinds of questions, and then those actually start to feed into like the movement, right? So I can give you some examples. Ola Shahba, who wasn't a member of like the official leadership group, but she was sort of an unofficial leader of the Revolutionary Youth Coalition. She was a leftist activist. She talked a lot about like just discovering her power. You see how she goes from being, she just turns into a warrior, right? So on January 25th, or I think it was 28th, she was actually I think she might have been the only woman on the front lines on what's called the Battle of the Bridge, like organizing the ranks of protesters that were coming up and fighting the police that confronted them for hours. There was like this back and forth between protesters and police. They were getting shot and killed. And she just was an incredible warrior that day, right? And you read that story in the book. But then, she was also somebody that was later subject to like sexual harassment by folks that she was once aligned with in the revolution itself, members of like the Muslim Brotherhood after they took power, right? So she's just a really interesting lens to kind of understand, like, how did like women make gains in the revolution, but at the same time not, right?
Yeah.
But just seeing their own subjective transformation, and you see this even happen with some of the young men in the book. But the other question, as you mentioned, was like visions and aspirations. Ahmed, I don't know if you wanted to say something before I jump into that.
I was going to say, yeah, like just on the, changing masculinities as well. Like this is like a really interesting look at, post-revolution, how a person changes. But yeah, I remember there was one interview when someone was they were like, well, Tunisians overthrew their dictator and like we have to act like men and overthrow ours. We like it's
Exactly.
embarrassing that the Tunisians did it first for some reason.
And there were women kind of egging that on too, like
Yeah.
saying like be a man,
Be a
be a
man.
revolutionary.
And also like
Yeah.
the it goes both ways, I guess. There's some people find like a more aggressive masculinity, and then there are others who you're saying like went in with that kind of aggressive masculine take, and then in the process of revolution, they were thinking, you know, it's our job to protect the women, and we have to stand in front of them and between them and the police, etc. And then what actually happened on the ground and what they saw is that women were protecting the men oftentimes as well, and like this particular man that you interviewed, just like that was a moment when he was just like, oh, these are our intellectual equals and like revolutionary comrades, etc. So like a really interesting look at how the revolution shaped the thinking there.
Yeah, I think, you know, speaking to that point is like revolutions don't happen in a vacuum, right? Like it was very much embedded in like gender dynamics, and movements themselves are gendering, right? Like they actually change the way you sort of understand or your own sense of yourself in terms of your gender. So like you just spoke to that dynamic exactly. I mean, even for young men, there was some of the activists that I interviewed after the revolution decided to run for parliament, right? Which is like not something they ever would have imagined for themselves. But I remember like following on the campaign trail, you know, Amra is, and just you could just see like he was a changed person. Like suddenly he was like really respected in his like neighborhood and was this kind of emerging political figure and leader. And that wasn't attention he ever got before, right? And
Yeah.
so for like men who, you know, especially I think in that time in the Mubarak period where there just wasn't a lot of opportunity for men. I mean, and unemployment was really high and people were anxious about their futures. It was just interesting to see like how the revolution had changed him and also attitudes around like young men who participated in activism.
Part of what the book says about like that openness is the fact that it was also such a youth-centered movement, like not youth exclusive, but like the kind of like, and I think we see that as a lot of like student-centered movements in the US also. I mean, thinking about like movements in the 60s, thinking about the current Palestine protests, thinking about the BLM movement, which was not exclusively at all youth, but I think there's a similar kind of feeling of a generation finding itself, or trying to at least.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think revolutionaries are just very transformative moments. I mean, the part of the reason why I document my own transformation in the book is because I started to also use myself as a lens for understanding their transformation because I felt like I was being transformed alongside them. And so I think those are really important to document as part of a study on the revolution because it's those emergent subjectivities that are going to be driving the next, you know, phase of the movement, or even, you know, it's those kind of ideas that are formulated that technically, like if they were to succeed, would be informing how they structure government or society, right? So I thought it was like kind of important to document before the revolution was foreclosed, how are these people thinking? How was their subjectivity transformed?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and I also, you know, you mentioned the part about like visions for the future or like how they imagined you know, a new Egyptian state. I think part of the reason why I asked those questions is because it wasn't exactly clear, right? The Egyptians didn't come up with any kind of like, there wasn't like some sort of a formal document, like a Declaration of Independence. Um, we don't have any documentation of like what was the actual vision for this uprising. Part of it, again, is because there was like really not a lot of time to formulate that clearly. As I mentioned, because it was sort of the cart before the horse kind of a dynamic where they were just trying to, you know, block the counter revolution from its moves and advances. And so they were kind of in this reactive mode, and there wasn't a lot of space to go and deliberate and think. And so unfortunately, there wasn't like a clear sense of like, okay, so like I asked questions like, what do you guys, everybody says that you guys wanted like a democratic movement. And the impression in the West is that sort of like you want something like a la the US, right? And they're like, no, that's not what we're talking about, right? So I think kind of trying to document exactly what were their attitudes and how they were thinking about these questions, even if vaguely at the time, just gives insight into where this could have gone.
Yeah.
And so that was part of the goal in sort of documenting some of that, even like their anti-imperialism, you know, how they were thinking about questions of development. I thought was really interesting, and to what extent like that their own vision or this budding vision that they didn't actually get to concretize was just informed by their own past, right? And their own stories. It wasn't something they were trying to import from the West or the US. Like it was, there was something creative and uniquely local to what was emerging in their minds and in their hearts at the time.
I think that's a good transition. Do you mind? I
Okay.
think that's a good transition to thinking towards what did ultimately come to pass after the revolution. So I think if we could kind of just briefly touch on the sort of what happened, the sort of way that after Mubarak was removed from office and Morsi came to power, and ultimately, Sisi being in power today. But I'd love to also maybe end, it doesn't have to be like a forcefully optimistic note if we're not feeling, if that's not sort of your analysis, but kind of what the state of youth movements in Egypt are to today, and sort of where this, all this sort of like things that unfolded in this moment, the potential for where they could be going kind of in the present moment, I think would be interesting.
Yeah. So the movement was roundly defeated starting in, I would say, 2013, right? This was a year after Mohamed Morsi was elected as president, and he was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, of course. And I won't go into a lot of detail there because I'm assuming maybe your listeners know a little bit about that. But essentially, that's when we kind of started to see the beginning of the end of the revolutionary movement. A lot of the activists I interviewed started to go into, like, some were arrested, some went into exile, and those that remained have just sort of been laying on the low. There hasn't really been any movement activity in Egypt. I mean, under Sisi, they've completely shut it down, and I think this is probably the most repressive period in modern Egyptian history. So today, there isn't really any sign of any kind of revolutionary movement in Egypt. It's not safe. The security state has come back with a vengeance.
Yeah.
That's not putting it lightly.
Sorry, I think this is a good, because we talked about how like the activists themselves were transformed, but like it goes two ways. Like the state itself was transformed and there were lessons learned,
Yeah.
and Sisi is remaking the terrain of possible rupture, like not only like in some sort of theoretical or legislative way, but like very much in the built environment of Egypt, right? Like
Mhm.
sorry, I just want to go back. Like in your book, you talk about like the informal urbanization and how that led to some, radicalization among the different neighborhoods that were organized. But also that was kind of where Mubarak, like, deployed the Boltegeya to go like surveil and beat up people. But now, Sisi has been clearing, a lot of these informal neighborhoods and built environments, and urban areas, urban centers, and has been remaking Egypt as like a mass surveillance state in the age of AI, which is a much different terrain. So like, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the state itself was also transformed in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the state learned a lot about what it means to, for instance, like give the opposition a little bit of space to protest, right?
Mm-hmm.
So historically, whenever there was some kind of incident in Palestine, Egyptians in some way came out in protest, or there was some kind of activism around that, right? That has kind of completely been shut down. I mean, Sisi did open the valve a little bit. I think it was in October of, was it 2023? Yeah, like shortly after the onslaught started in Gaza, but quickly, and they learned their lessons before this, but I think because of like the pressure on him to do something, he was expecting people to kind of come out and support for him in some of the, positions he was taking in opposition to the U.S. about allowing Palestinians into Egypt. And so the point is, he opened this space for protests, and folks went directly to Tahrir and started to chant against the regime. And they were saying, I mean, they actually reinvented old chants from the revolution. عيش حرية, فلسطين عربية, right? Which is a spinoff of عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية, bread, freedom, and an Arab Palestine, which is remarkable because it shows just how much that is present in their kind of revolutionary imagination, Palestine. So the point is, and they shut it down really quick. And now it's like, if there's any protest, it's like limited to the steps of the journalist syndicate building. So, there's people that have studied this more than me, so I'm not going to be able to comment. I mean, like Hossam al-Hamalawi, that's like all of
Yeah.
his work right
Friend of the
now.
show, shout
Um,
out.
yeah, exactly. Get ready for his. It sounds like a great book that's coming out.
Yeah,
But
super excited.
the point is that they've learned, right? It's not just the
You
revolution as
can't
it learned.
even go to Tahrir now. Like I think we mentioned it before, but like we were in Egypt like 2 summers ago, and we were just like, oh, let's check out Tahrir. Like this was my first time back since my family moved to the U.S. when I was 5, right? Like I was born in Egypt, but I pretty much grew up in the U.S. and that was my first time back. And I was like, oh, I'd love to see Tahrir and see what it looks like now. And as we approached it, like a bunch of armed guards just came out of the darkness and were just like, you can't be here.
Yeah. No, exactly. I think there's like gates now. I haven't actually been back since 2011 myself, so I don't know what it's like, but I imagine I'll be really like depressed, like
Mhm.
going there and not seeing like, because there were protests almost, I mean, just constantly in the 6 months I was there. So that's like my last memory of Tahrir. But yeah, definitely the counter-revolution has learned. They stepped up their surveillance. They're now even engaging in transnational repression, which is like I think this is, I don't know that this happened before the revolution, but we know of several activists for their activism, like, the young men who staged the protests at like the sit-ins and the Netherlands, at the embassies in the Netherlands. There's also another activist in Qatar right now whose father was arrested because of his activism. So there's like these new things tactics and strategies that they're employing. So it's really hard to engage in any kind of like political activism on behalf of Egypt. I think a lot of it is just producing writing right now and through adversarial journalism. Mada Masr is still, which is an independent news outlet in Egypt. They still produce a lot of like investigative reports on just like the conditions in Egypt post, 2011 or since the revolution was defeated. That's kind of what's I would say the form that activism has taken. But I always say like, but the thing is like that it technically didn't die. The Egyptian revolution, or it was defeated. It wasn't a failure, it was a defeat. In the sense that this is a long war, right? And there's going to be multiple battles, but they had to start somehow, right? Like there had to be a moment where people tested the possibility. And so in that sense, I think it's really important to like remember like that what revolutionaries actually did for us. I mean, that moment on January 25th when they took to the streets and ran with the opportunity was a huge gift because I think globally, like nobody really thought it was possible to have a revolution. And so just sparking that imagination, and it traveled, right? It traveled to the US and it took on like the form of Occupy. And then from there, we had, a whole movement. I mean, they basically revived the leftist movement here in the US. Before 2011, it was pretty like dead. Right before that, I think the last time there was like major political protest and activity was around the Iraq War. But there was no cohesive, coherent left movement in the US. Certainly nobody was talking about political revolution. And so when we saw somebody like Bernie Sanders emerge in 2016, that was because revolutionaries in Egypt had a lot to do with that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like through the Occupy movement and then Bernie.
And he was saying we want a political revolution. I'm like, that was straight. I mean, that came from Egypt. I mean, I'm sure that was his orientation, but saying it publicly in that way before, it was really the Egyptian revolution that opened up that opportunity.
He should have refused, just like the Revolutionary Youth Council refused to actually engage with Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, so I that's something that I try to dwell on a lot these days as I think about like what did we actually gain from that experience and what did we learn from it? What does it tell us? How do we use it to kind of develop our theories and ideas for how to carry out a revolution in the future? And I think they gave us a ton of insights to work with, even just their pain points, right? Like
Absolutely.
some of the things I mentioned around like, okay, how do you think about like consensus building in a moment of urgency, revolutionary urgency, or these pain points can be like the starting points for imagining new ideas. And certainly that's where my own imagination is going. So I don't think that there's any like, people ask like, what's the lesson of the Egyptian revolution? And I'm like, well, there's not, or even just in my book, like what are the lessons I talk about? And I'm like, I don't know that there's a clear lesson besides, revolutionary situations are still possible. So be prepared, right? You have to kind of have a sense of like what you're trying to do And that boils down to two questions. It's the question of organization and project, right? Like, and you need to have the latter before you can have the former, in my mind. I mean, they can be developed dialectically, but you need like a destination, right? And the organization is like how to get there. And so I think that was something it was hard for Egyptian revolutionaries to clarify clearly in their mind. And a lot of tensions erupted because I think in the end, it wasn't just about trying to, you know, like they wanted to carry out a revolution in Egypt, but I think they wanted something much broader than that. Like they wanted a new world, right? Because you can't just carry out a revolution in Egypt. I mean, one of the questions I think about, so I say that that's kind of the main lesson, which is, these moments are still possible, so you have to be ready. But then like, what does it mean to be ready, right? And so, for instance, if we're thinking about like revolutions are about capturing power, right? One of the questions my book forces us to answer is like, well, what do you do if the power within the country is not solely within the hands of the ruling elite of that country, but also is spread out kind of globally or transnationally, right? Like some of that power is in the hands of like the UAE and it's in the hands of the US. So
Right.
I think one of the things they found themselves up against is like, how do we capture power? Like, right. And I think that they wouldn't have known that unless they confronted that challenge in a revolutionary moment. And so now that we see it, the question that comes back is like, okay, what does the project look like in light of these circumstances? This isn't like the 20th century when power was more contained within the state. It's like spread diffusely across different nodes globally. So does that mean we need to have like a broader transnational movement that's really thinking about like global revolution in a different way? Do we need to think about like, can you even have like a revolution within a nation state, right? Like,
Yeah.
is part of the challenge that we need to dismantle the nation state as like as a political model, right? And what does it look like? Or what does it look
Yes.
like?
Yeah,
We agree.
if that's an outstanding question,
Yeah.
there's the answer.
But the point is like, so if you read my book with that lens, there's a ton of questions it raises, right? That I think, like I said, are kind of understanding these pain points, and then you could start to like understand, figure out like what could be a way forward, right? It just helps us surface like the complexity of the challenge, and I think that's a real gift that Egyptian revolutionaries gave to us, is really helping us understand the complexity of carrying out revolution in the 21st century.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Very well stated. Rusha Latif, thank you so much for joining us. The book, again, is Tahrir's Youth, Leaders of a Leaderless Revolution. You can get it at AUC Press. But can you just quickly, as we sign off, tell people like what you're working on now and where they can find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on my website, rushalatif.com. And I'm on, like Instagram, and that's probably the one I'm more active on, but other social media sites as well. I think that what I'm working on now is sort of related to what I just shared about like really trying to understand like what do we do with all of these learnings. I feel like there's still a lot of room for like theorizing and imagining new models for like revolutionary organization. So I'm just trying to think about that a little bit more deeply. So the next project I'm working on kind of looks at that question, and I'm trying to draw on some different methodologies for helping us answer it. So one of the things that I got into over the course of trying to finish this book was into like design theory, design innovation. There's a lot of stuff I think in that space, a lot of tools, creative tools that we could use because those are people who think through this, they look at like, how do you improve a thing? How do you improve a service? How do you improve an organization, right? And a lot of that has to do with trying to understand the pain points of its users and using that as starting points for iterating the model, right?
That's so amazing. I love that framing of the project because I mean, in my career, kind of think about this a lot, but I also think like lately, I've really been thinking about the importance of art in movement and how in the US, there just like really isn't, I mean, there's some, but like there isn't really like widespread political art that is really speaking to people, in my opinion. Prove me wrong, but anyway, like
No,
design is such a huge part of it. Yeah.
I agree completely. And so I think there's a lot of really creative tools that a toolbox and kind of in that space that could work really well and thinking about the future of movement. So
I love that.
I'm kind of experimenting with that. I'm still in its very early stages, but I'm excited about it.
Well, we look forward to having you back whenever that's ready to be shared.
Thanks.
Again, Rusha, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you guys.